Okay, so good morning, everyone. My name is Bobby Warren. Let me learn how to progress my slides here. And today we're going to talk about toilet floors and C. difficile transmission. A little bit about me before we get going, so you know where I'm coming from, why I'm talking about this, why I care about this. So I founded and currently serve as the lab director for the Disinfection Resistance and Transmission Epidemiology Lab, which was intentional because I wanted the acronym to spell out to say dirty. And I think it's pretty fitting based on the work that we do, focusing on the transmission of pathogens, particularly in the clinical setting, but we are expanding on that. And we also serve as the de facto molecular epilab for the Duke University Health System. Click. So in March, the 10th annual C. diff Summit and Lobby Day, if you were there, I gave a talk entitled The C. diff Dilemma, How Hospital Policies and Environmental Contamination Keep Infections Alive. If you weren't, I'll give a synopsis, so don't worry about that. I was focusing there on the big picture, how outdated guidance, bleach bans, gaps in measurements, all work together in ways that keep C. difficile transmission alive, even when we're actively trying to stop it. But today I really wanted to zoom in and look specifically at bathrooms, toilets, floors, and yes, even socks, and how all these pieces create real exposure pathways that are a bit covered up. So for a quick refresher for everyone, if you are in need of it or unaware, the environment is really important in healthcare, particularly with C. difficile. The organism C. difficile spreads to the fecal-oral route, which is pretty common for pathogens. And once their spores hit a surface, they can persist for weeks, months, to sometimes even years, making the hospital environment a very obvious and serious reservoir. Floors, bathrooms, equipment bases, they all turn into passive transport systems that expose not only patients, whether they're C. diff patients or not, but also family caregivers and healthcare workers. Unfortunately, with C. diff, there's a lag time from exposure to colonization to infection, which can, in some cases take years, which makes attribution very difficult, meaning we don't know exactly, when the event occurred that actually required or caused someone to get colonized. And I've kind of coined that as silent spreading. And since there are no symptoms immediately, there's really no urgency to solve the issue. So if we want to prevent acquisition, we really do need to manage the environment where exposure is frequently occurring. But don't just take my word for it. Here's some data to kind of back me up that the environment is crucial in all patient rooms, not just current C. diff patient rooms. In one of my previous studies, as you can see up on the slide, we looked at environmental contamination of patient rooms for 3 different patient cohorts. Patients that were actively undergoing a C. diff infection, those that were known to be colonized with C. diff, and then control patients who actually had a PCR negative test, meaning that there was no presence of any C. difficile in their stool within 24 hours of us actually enrolling them in the study. There was tons of cool things we found from this, but unfortunately, one of the more shocking ones is that 15% of control room samples, meaning that the current patient in the room did not have or was not colonized with C. diff, 15% of the samples were actually contaminated with C. diff via culture. And upon bed flow review, none of those patient rooms had actually had a C. diff patient housed in them within the past year, but we were still able to culture it from the environment. So pretty concerning. The next thing I'd like to convince you of in that exact same study is that the floor specifically is contaminated with C. diff. So in the same study, we sampled the patient bathroom, which included the floor around the toilet, and in all 3 arms, the floor was contaminated with C. diff. In addition to that, 81% of infected and colonized rooms had an isolate recovered in the environment that matched the current patient in the room, meaning that the current patient in the room is 81% of the time actively shedding to the environment. And then most shockingly, at least to me, 15% of all rooms had more than one robotype, meaning that there's one unique isolate of C. diff in the environment, which, big picture, that means that 15% of the time in any patient room, there was C. diff contamination in the room that was not from the current patient. So, naturally, your next question is, maybe how does it get there other than the more common routes that we're aware of? I don't know if this will let me play this little video. I doubt it. But on the right-hand side, you can see there was going to be a little video of basically just a toilet flushing with some luminescent particles in there. And on the left indicates just how high one singular flush actually makes the aerosol and droplets go, which is pretty high. So there have been lots of studies on toilet plumes, is what they're called. They've been primarily focused on viral pathogens, but we're coming around to it now on bacterial. And as you can see, they found some pretty key pieces of information in tons of studies. One is the obvious one: aerosolization does occur with flushing of a toilet, particularly in the healthcare setting. The aerosolization, as well as the droplets, can go anywhere from 1 to 3 meters or 3 to 9 feet. And those particles can remain airborne for up to 30 minutes, depending on the ventilation of the bathroom, the relative humidity, the temperature, etc. Obviously, that contaminates surfaces. In hospital bathrooms, they're usually pretty small, and 3 meters, I would argue, covers most of, any surface in that bathroom. And primarily they've been studied on viruses, but as of late, there has been some work with E. coli and C. diff and more lab-controlled studies. And a key concern for this issue would be shared bathrooms. Probably your natural instinct is to think, well, why don't we just close the lids? Or at least it was for me. But there's been tons of studies on this that show, they do help, but they're not amazing. So they do help for aerosolization for surfaces that are above or farther away from the toilet, which is an overall win, but it actually doesn't help for the toilet itself. And it doesn't really do much for items that are close by horizontally and definitely not the floor. Another thing to consider is in the healthcare setting, toilet seats are pretty rare. It may be something you haven't thought about before, but they do make it harder for ADA folks to use. They do increase the risk for falls, which of course is something that hospitals follow very closely. And then anytime you add a new item, no matter how helpful it is, it's another thing that needs to be cleaned, disinfected, and it can also break and incur costs for the hospital. Why does it matter? This is the big question I get a lot. I've been beating on the floor and toilets for a while now, and usually this is the question we get. Why do we actually care if the floor is contaminated? Who is using the floor? It's a fair argument, but I would argue that there are some things that are overlooked in the setting. So how are things moving up from the floor, regardless of how contaminated it is, to a clinically relevant space? I think there's an item that every hospital patient uses that does that exact thing, the non-slip sock. This bad boy comes in contact with the floor wherever the patient goes. If they are ambulating and using the toilet, it goes to the base of the toilet, the hallways if they're walking around, and then it comes in contact with their patient bed, particularly their linens and their footboard. And, a lot of medical equipment is actually stored in the footboard, because if you put it on the bed rails, it actually makes it difficult for patients to get in and out of the bed. So as a result, these socks are coming in contact with the footboard, which is usually loaded up with medical equipment. So it's a pretty easy argument to make that that's an exposure pathway. An issue we're facing with the idea of the floor is that, yeah, on paper it makes sense, but no one believes you until you have the data, which is a fair argument. So we actually have a current R01 study where, our primary focus isn't to prove this, but we have kind of added this as one of the components. So what we're doing is we're sampling the environment of C. diff colonized and infected patients over the course of 3 days. We're also retrieving the patient's unique C. diff isolate. And we're sampling the floor in both the bathroom and the patient room, as well as the patient's socks and the footboard. And you can probably guess, based on what I've said so far, that we hypothesize we'll be able to see a patient's C. diff isolate make its way to the floor in the patient room and or the bathroom. And non-patient isolates that are in the environment, remember 15% of the time, move from the environment to their socks and or the footboard. And then we'll finally have some definitive transmission pathways to show. The next question is, okay, it's dirty. Why don't you just disinfect it, right? That's what infection prevention is all about. Unfortunately, we have to talk a little bit more into the weeds here about spores. So when a vegetative C. diff cell senses stress, such as just like a lack of nutrients, it can do something called sporulate. And as you can see in the figure on the right, you don't have to worry about the extreme details. The cell forms something called a forespore inside of itself, and then it actually lyses its original outer casing, which is a cell membrane. Why is that important? First off, it shuts down metabolism and effectively goes dormant, which is why it can last on surfaces for a really long time. But it also has changed its external facing surface. It used to be a cell membrane, but now it's a thick protein coat, as you can see in the image on the bottom right. Oops, it didn't move, did it? Yeah, it did. Cool. This new protein coat changes actually how we can disinfect it and kill it, unfortunately. So the most common healthcare disinfectants are quaternary ammonium compounds that we colloquially call quats. But these target lipid cell membranes, which the spore no longer has, right? It sloughed that thing off. So those are not effective. Alcohol disinfectants like ethanol or isopropanol, they can work on proteins, but they actually require a decent amount of water to be inside the cell that it's trying to lyse. And unfortunately, spores have little to no water inside. Peroxide can work. It's an oxidizer, but it usually requires such a high concentration that safety concerns come into play. 6% is usually the going rate for a spore or higher. So sodium hypochlorite or bleach can easily disrupt the protein coat. We've been using it for a while. It's cost effective, so it's a pretty ideal disinfectant for spores. If we've got some disinfectant reps on the call, I will acknowledge there are others coming out. There are new disinfection technologies, but as of now, bleach is still the best cost-effective method. We'll see if that remains. However, most hospitals don't actually allow us to use bleach on the floors, even at terminal disinfection for rooms that house C. diff patients or other enterics. Why? So bleach actually removes the wax coating of floors, and that's very costly to replace. And also with the silent spreading nature of C. diff, it's really difficult to provide a cost-benefit analysis of bleaching floors because a cost-benefit analysis in infection prevention in general is theoretical anyway, but now ours is extra theoretical since we're not actually measuring colonization, where normally we would be measuring infection. However, there is some hope. As kind of an analogy, UVC is a widely used disinfection means that is well known to degrade plastics over time. It turns them yellow, brittle, and they eventually break. There's tons of plastics in hospital rooms. But thanks to a few key studies demonstrating the impact or the cost savings of preventing the harm via UVC disinfection, it's been enough to convince some hospitals that it's worth paying the cost to replace the plastics. So it's not out of the question that the wax issue can be overcome. Sorry. But what is painfully ironic is that we don't even have HICPEC or the Healthcare Infection Control Practices Advisory Committee on our side on this issue. First, they were recently dismantled by the current administration. It doesn't seem likely that they will reform in the near future, if at all. And then second, the last time they published a guideline on the environment in general was in 2003. They have updated it along the way. The most recent one was 2019. But their take on floor disinfection at all, so not just with bleach, but at all, is as follows, and it's also on the slide. Extraordinary cleaning and decontamination of floors in the healthcare setting is unwarranted. Studies have demonstrated that disinfection of floors offers no advantage over regular detergent/water cleaning and has minimal or no impact on the occurrence of healthcare-associated infections. So it's kind of a gut punch when your own, expert panel is telling you it's not needed. But if you actually look at the citations that they have provided in this section, again, this was written in 2003, but has been updated. This section has not been updated. These references are extremely dated. The most recent one is from 1999, and they go back as far as 1966. And I think we can all agree environmental hygiene and awareness has come a long way since then. So this claim is minimally and politely in need of a modern look for sure. So when arguing for the bleaching of floors, not only are you fighting the hospital administration, but they also have your own expert guidelines on their side. So it's pretty tough to pull off. It's not a great bargaining position to be in. The next thing to consider is that there is suboptimal disinfection. Even if bleach was allowed on floors, disinfection compliance is quite the hot button and difficult issue. In a previous study of mine, we were just measuring the efficacy of a spray disinfectant, and we were comparing it to what the hospital already did to make sure that the control arm was actually being compared fairly. We put down a little fluorescent marker that just showed if something had been wiped clean. Unfortunately, only 11% of those markers were removed, meaning that only 11% of the surface were actually disinfected by whoever was responsible at that time for those areas in the hospital. And, of those 11%, some were likely due to incidental contact on the bed rail and not actual cleaning. So this is a huge area that we can improve on. But I'd never like to throw environmental services under the bus without including this slide. It's way too easy to look at EVS workers, get frustrated, and just say, hey, do better, just clean, just do your job. most notably because there's been tons of studies who have looked into the relationship between EVS and the clinical staff and found some pretty saddening, but what I think are likely expected things. Very broadly, the relationship is toxic. EVS workers are always found to be prideful of their work, but they feel invisible, undervalued, underappreciated, almost completely separated from the rest of the crew. And they also feel like they're compensated poorly relative to the importance of their role. And I always include this slide anytime I talk about disinfection compliance, because they really do play a crucial role in infection prevention. And while they don't directly take care of patients, they have the ability to prevent so many infections. So I think we need to invite them and make sure that they feel valued, and that they understand the impact they can have. So in summary, the healthcare environment is a C. difficile reservoir, no matter where it is in a patient room. And not only does it expose patients who do or do not have C. diff, but also family members and healthcare workers. Silent spreading nature of it creates this lack of urgency from most folks, particularly administration. And just a reminder that 15% of the samples in our non-C. difficile rooms were culture positive for C. diff, of which no C. diff patient had been in there for at least a year. And then 15% of samples had more than one ribotype, meaning that even in C. diff rooms, there was contamination from other C. diff patients. Toilet plumes contaminate up to 3 meters away, notably the floor. Non-slip socks are a really easy target to mat floor contamination and needs more data. Spores require specific disinfectants, notably sodium hypochlorite. Bleaching floors is frequently banned, and we don't have our own guidelines committee on our advisory council on our side. Disinfection compliance is already suboptimal, even if we did institute bleach, and EVS needs to be brought onto the team, not separated. If you only take away one sentence from everything I've just said really quickly, is that managing the environment is key to preventing acquisition. You can add C. difficile to the end of that, but it's important for all healthcare-associated infections. And with that, I am happy to take any questions. Unfortunately, I brought up a lot of bad things and a lot of rough scenarios and no actual solutions yet, but I will take any questions. Oops, I cannot hear you, Christian.
I just realized that I had my mic muted. Sorry about that.
No.
Occupational hazard. So we do have a couple of questions coming in. The first one is, how do you handle disinfecting a carpet?
That is an excellent question. If it's a carpet in a hospital, this is just one of those answers I know you don't want. I would just say, why do we have carpet there? But if you absolutely have to do it, I personally think it does need to require a sporicide, which I still am, partial to bleach. And with carpet, that's probably going to ruin it. So that's just one of those issues where it really depends on your budget and what you're going after. If you don't mind it looking awful, I would bleach it. If you have the funds to replace it with any non-carpet, I think that is the ideal.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's it's like kind of having carpet in the bathroom, like it's a terrible idea.
Yeah.
Then the next one is, what about sniper chlorine dioxide?
Yeah, I knew some folks are going to bring up some other chemicals. So anytime you have questions about, will this chemical or will this product work, I would encourage you to look them up on the EPA and FDA registry to see what they are actually approved to disinfect, as well as, their own website. But a lot of the times things will make it on their own website before it makes it through the EPA's list. So I would always check the EPA list. If it's on there, it's also required to have instructions for use depending on what you're trying to disinfect, whether it be a floor or a piece of medical equipment. So I would suggest checking the EPA list. I'm not personally familiar with chlorine dioxide, but it should be pretty easy to look up.
Then someone asks, what is the bleach ratio in cleaning? And I think that might depend on what product you're using.
Yeah, that'll depend on what product, what they're approved for. But, it really depends on what you're disinfecting. If you're going for the floors, I would feel completely comfortable going to our usual healthcare 6%. But of course, putting on that on some medical equipment is just going to degrade it insanely fast. So I would also, point you to the EPA and the IFUs for those.
Then we have a question and a comment. So Brenda asks, how does one disinfect electronics? And then George, our friend from Ecolab across the pond, says, thoughts on 35% HPV instead of UVC, e.g. bioquell, no degradation of plastics, safe on electronics, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, so for electronics, this is not a one size fits all, but generally when you disinfect anything that's not a surface that's going to be eroded. So if you're disinfecting like a phone, for example, if you disinfect it with bleach, you're going to want to let it sit for the contact time, but then go behind it with ethanol to get the residual bleach off of there, because it is going to erode just about anything you put on it. So as long as the disinfectant is safe to disinfect with bleach, I would do it with bleach, contact time, and then follow it up with ethanol to remove the residual. Thoughts on 35%? I'm assuming that's hydrogen peroxide vapor. In an ideal world, I would love to have every hospital room be airtight so we can just pump it full of hydrogen peroxide vapor. That's what we use in our BSL-3 and BSL-4 labs in the United States. It's just one of those things it's never going to happen. But, you know, I don't necessarily have a preference for disinfectants. I would need to probably know more about the specific application method, et cetera. You know, not to necessarily like harp on this one thing, but one thing that I'm not a amazing fan of in our field is the random decision on like how many logs is good to reduce. For a lot of folks, they'll put down 3 log on a surface and they're like, we killed 3 log. And sometimes they'll put 8 log and they'll kill 8 log. And it's just not standardized enough for me to give a great opinion right off the bat.
So unfortunately, that is all the time we have with you. I would like to spend more. It's always good to hear from you. We did have a couple of questions in the chat, and Erin has posted. We did a webinar a week ago with Dr. Kathy Egan talking all about household hygiene for C. diff patients. So Bobby's talk was mostly about the healthcare space. So definitely check that out. It's like an hour, maybe 40 minutes long. Great information if you have somebody at home or if you yourself are home with C. diff. Great information on how you can help keep yourself and everyone else safe. So thank you so much, Bobby, for presenting. This was great information, and I look forward to seeing you soon.
Sounds good. Thanks, everyone.